By practice, I would describe as performance-centered multimedia. I've described it as I perform images, and I also describe my performances as enactments. I'm very interested in the idea of enactment, and how, I suppose, if the body is the medium, if performance is the medium of the body in time and space, and witness, the witness of the audience, but also the witness of one to oneself, and how collectively and individually that witness acts to sort of consolidate, perceive, register, and in a way mark what is happening, what is enacted. In that way, performances sort of function as rituals, I suppose. But if performance is the medium of the body in time and space, that has to include the mind as is not distinct from the body. And if the mind is part of the medium thereby, so are our thoughts, our sensory and phenomenological experience. So I sort of try to treat, in a way, my moment-to-moment experience as a sort of creative material. And works are just, I suppose, the artifacts or the traces of that process being lived out by this specific body and its specific experiential algorithm. In the passage at the Pool of Bethesda, Jesus apparently it was where the disabled and the chronically ill, in effect, or to use possibly a problematic term, but one that's kind of fascinating in terms of its history, the term invalids. It was where the sick would gather, basically, around this pool. And there was this one man who apparently had been coming to the pool for years, but had never been able to get into the pool because I think he was paralyzed. And there had been rumors of this miracle worker, Jesus, that he had heard about. And Jesus came this day to the Pool of Bethesda, and the man asked him for healing. And Jesus told him, "Do you want to be made healed? Take up thy bed and walk." And then the man does so. And there's this interesting exchange that goes on there, the sort of power dynamic between someone who is effectively able-bodied but also arguably is perfection, as in it's literally God or the Son of God or the lived embodiment of God's word. Jesus is referred to as the Word made flesh, who basically makes this statement, gives this commandment to this person who is not able-bodied. The onus is sort of like put on, I suppose, the sick to heal themselves, which I'm not like... I try not to have a particular bias any which way towards that sensibility. I think it's interesting, and I think there's some sort of... I think there's a lot to be gleaned there, both in terms of criticizing that attitude, in terms of it's the responsibility of, like, you know, the oppressed, in effect, to sort of reclaim or otherwise, their liberation. But also then it's a statement that potentially allows for some, I suppose, cognitive or self-imaged agency. Having lived with multiple sort of chronic conditions, the principal one that's impacted my life being chronic pain, which left me bedbound for a very long time and still does at various points, something I manage. I would think about Christianity, and also being queer, it's sort of this weird melting pot of... identities, like what not to do or what not to be, basically, under, I suppose, contemporary Christian tenets. Anyway, Bethesda was a performance at Revision Performing Arts Festival in Belfast, and it was one iteration of performance/image-making series that involved sandpaper. And the idea is that I prime the canvas of basically industrial lengths of sandpaper, using my flesh and blood, basically. Bethesda, I would like walk back and forth, wiping my feet after having removed my shoes, the idea that you're stepping on holy ground, another sort of biblical invocation. Upon having shed my blood into the grain of the canvas, I then, in this specific instance, inscribed the question, do you want to be made healed, in chalk across the primed canvas. In other cases, I would paint or draw over it, such as in my solo show in Pallas earlier this year, where 3 Studies for the Foot of a Bed, which was a triptych of paintings that I did following a sandpaper priming. But Bethesda was one iteration of that. I don't know, I was really interested in the idea of the different, I suppose, circles of hell to which people are to which souls are allocated based on how they lived their lives. And the 7th circle of hell, which had multiple tiers, which largely concerned violence, but also potentially acts of violence towards God, that is, abominations, such as one being homosexuality. In one of the tiers of the 7th circle, they ran on burning sand for all eternity. Before I became chronically ill, one of the ways in which I would connect to my dad, who was sort of like the principal patriarchal figure to me, this, a queer person who had been raised and socialized as male and as Christian, and not to be any of the things that I was. It was one of the ways in which I connected with my father before I then lost him a few years ago now. So I suppose it's sort of this, this weird sort of narrative resolution that I'm enacting, that I'm embodying, enacting upon the canvas, but also upon the audience in a way, and upon myself. I suppose it's a ritual in a way, but I almost like to think of it in a more machinistic sort of way, as in it's a function. It's less to do with though I love me some mysticism, the idea of, I suppose, some spiritual process that I'm engaging in. For me, I'm also interested in the sort of the mechanics of it. Like, why is this body doing this? Like, to what end? But it's what it's doing. So yeah, Bethesda would have been one iteration of my sandpaper series, exploring, imbuing the work with the materiality of the body of the artist. So part of it is, literally my blood, sweat, and tears going into this work. But there is also a sort of, literal shedding that is occurring. I suppose then the canvas acts as this sort of like crucible for me to like crush up basically the materials of both my body and then the sort of external materials that my body responds to in, say, the form of paint or chalk or whatever the material is. I think it arose as well out of, challenging myself to really investigate the materiality of my work. It's a sort of impulsive, sort of reflexive empathy we have. It's like you start to feel the pain in your own way, maybe not to the same degree, but you're able to conceptualize what's happening, at least maybe only to a degree. I suppose that's the thing. When you come into something as communal and as performance or any witness-based ritual, there is that idea that we're all sharing in it to some degree. And then, of course, you have this sort of idea of like the martyr, which Jesus obviously sort of represents, and you have that sort of dynamic represented in multiple belief systems. And I think beyond the theistic as well, I think it indicates our own propensity towards, in effect, the sacrifice of, if not literal bodies, the idea of bodies. Whereas once there might have been actual human sacrifice, now there's almost character sacrifice, as in, these images that we create of other people, these images that we create of ourselves, eventually have to be broken down and destroyed in some form or another. Yeah. For me, a sort of natural conclusion, if the body is the medium, is that the mind is also the medium. And that includes its psychological narrative, the one it creates for itself. Um, I mean, from what I understand, it would appear that psychologically, but also neurologically, we are very our memory changes a lot. We're kind of in each remembrance of something, effectively updating it or downgrading it, as in its memory itself changes as we, are extruded through time, as our bodies are extruded through time. And to that end, the story you are telling yourself and living out these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies that we all sort of embody to one degree or another, because each body is in effect this sort of its own belief system, its own belief ecosystem. I think it was Ken Wilber who described not hierarchies but holarchies, which are basically these holistic, multi-tiered, multi-dimensional sort of power structures that are, I suppose, in effect, inevitable, but that to one degree or another non-linearly distribute power in a way that we can only sort of register or habitually register as hierarchical and oppressive. The story you're telling about yourself to yourself in living it out. Again, the idea that performance is this tool of self-creation. And for me, if the mind is the material, then that exists not just in performance space, not just in the staged convention of the performance begins at this time and ends here. No, it keeps going.